Welcome to the second interview in the United States Capitol Historical Society series of interviews with former members of Congress. My name is Ron Saracen. I'm a former member of Congress from Connecticut and also president of the United States Capitol Historical Society. Our guest today is former member Norm Mineta of California. This is also the first interview in a special series we have planned with Asian Pacific American members of Congress. In these interviews, former members will relive their experiences and their memories of people and dates and events that took place in the United States Capitol. It's our hope these recollections will provide listeners with a deeper appreciation for the human dimension of representative government in this temple of liberty we call the United States Capitol. Norman Yoshio Mineta was born in San Jose, California on November 12, 1931. His family was one of thousands of Japanese Americans interned during World War II. He graduated from the University of California, Berkeley with a BS in Business Administration and then served as an intelligence officer in the U.S. Army. His public career began in 1967 when he was appointed to the San Jose City Council. Elected mayor of San Jose in 1971, he was the first Asian American mayor of a major U.S. city. Norm Mineta was elected to the U.S. House of Representatives in 1974 and served from 1975 till 1995. President Bill Clinton appointed him Secretary of Commerce in 1999, the first Asian Pacific American to hold a cabinet post. And in 2001, President George Bush appointed him Secretary of Transportation, a position he held until July of 2006. Norman, our interview with Tom Foley and Bob Michael, they spoke about how moved they were the first time they were sworn in as members of Congress. You first walk on the floor and you're asked to raise your right hand. What were your thoughts on that occasion?
Well, first of all, I was carrying my son, who's 3 years old, and when Carl Albert asked everybody to raise their right hand, so I'm holding Stuart in my left arm, and raising my right arm. And the only thing I could think of at the time was, what's a little kid like you from San Jose, California, doing in a place like this? And I was thinking, it can only happen in a country like the United States of America. It's just hard to imagine that, let's say in 1942, being evacuated from your home, placed on trains under armed guard, transported off to camp, and here some 20-some years later, being able to be sworn in as a member of the Congress.
Now, when that happened, you were 10, 11 years old?
11 years old.
And what was that like? I mean, did you really understand what was happening? I mean, I can't imagine what it could have been like when an entire community is uprooted and then moved off to Wyoming.
And for a 10, 11-year-old kid, it really didn't have the impact. But I've only seen my dad cry 3 times. Once was on the 7th of December because he couldn't understand why the land of his birth was now attacking the land of his heart. The second time I saw him cry was on the 31st of May, 1942, when we were boarding the trains to leave San Jose to go off to camp. And the third time was 1956, when my mother passed away. But the impact was really on the adults, on my older sisters and my brother. For me as an 11-year-old kid, this was, oh boy, an overnight train ride, a long train ride. And once we got on those trains, there were armed guards at end of each car, so we couldn't move from car to car. But I was wearing my Cub Scout uniform and a baseball glove and baseball bat. And when I got on the train, the MPs confiscated the bat on the basis the bat could be used as a lethal weapon. But I was in my uniform because the families were all going to be confined to one car and you couldn't move from car to car. So Boy Scouts and Cub Scouts were used as messengers between the cars. So I was in my Cub Scout uniform.
And they had set that up ahead of time?
They had set that up ahead of time.
Wow.
So it was a different impact in terms of an 11-year-old perspective versus my dad, who's, excuse me, insurance business was all of a sudden terminated in February of '42. So, and then my folks had to store everything. We could only carry the luggage that we could take to camp.
So your family was uprooted. Your father's business was just stopped. And how long were you in Wyoming in the camp?
Well, first we went to what were called assembly centers, and what the Army had done was to commandeer all of the racetracks and fairgrounds in Washington, Oregon, and California, because those facilities had built-in living quarters, namely horse stables. So we were going to Santa Anita, the racetrack in Southern California. So this was May of '42, and we were there until November of '42.
Wow. At Santa Anita.
And then in November of '42, we were then transported from Santa Anita, California, to Hart Mountain, Wyoming.
Many members recall that when they first reached Congress, they found a mentor, someone who they looked up to and kind of guided them along. Was there anyone in the House that you looked to at that time?
Well, I was very, very fortunate in that Carl Albert, the then Speaker, was a very good friend of my brother-in-law, who was a executive secretary of the Japanese American Citizens League, and then he became the Washington representative for the Japanese American Citizens League here in D.C. And over the years, he got to know Carl Albert real well. So when I got sworn in, and right after that, I built a relationship with the Speaker because I was also president of our freshman class. So I had a great deal of contact with him. But I was also fortunate to have both Patsy Mink and Congressman Sparky Matsunaga as my mentors in the House, and my very, very good friend Congressman Don Edwards, who had the adjoining district to mine in San Jose. So that was the sort of the senior leadership who I turned to. Senator Inoue was already in the Senate. And of course I turned to him for a great deal of assistance as well. But the closer ones at hand were really Sparky and Patsy Mink.
The Civil Liberties Act of 1988 is also something that you are credited with being a major moving force behind. How did that come about?
Well, it started out with the National Japanese American Citizens League at their 1978 convention, passing a one-sentence resolution saying that they were going to undertake legislation to seek redress and a national apology for the wrongful internment and evacuation of Japanese Americans during World War II.
And then, and you had other colleagues involved in that program. Who did you work with to make all that happen?
Well, after the National Japanese American Citizens League had passed their resolution, Senator Inoue, Senator Matsunaga, the late Congressman Bob Matsui from Sacramento, California, and I got together and we were wondering, what are we going to do now with this one sentence resolution from the National Japanese American Citizens League? And Senator Inoue said, you know, if it hadn't been for the Warren Commission to talk about the Kennedy assassination, or there was another commission to look into the killings at Kent State, and those became bestsellers. They were well known by the public, and the two issues really surfaced. And he said, until we get the American public educated about what happened in 42, and then our colleagues will then understand. So Senator Matsunaga talked about his bill relating to Native Hawaiian claims. And so I had a legislative director by the name of Glenn Roberts, and you might remember his brother Steve Roberts, who was a reporter with the New York Times. But Glenn was really a bright legislative director. And so he took Sparky's bill on Native Hawaiian claims and rewrote it to set up another commission. And this commission was called the Commission on Wartime Relocation and Internment of Civilians. And so that legislation got passed, I believe it was in 1978, and then in 1980 that commission report actually came out, and it said that it was a gross injustice in terms of what happened to those of Japanese ancestry, and said that it was due to wartime hysteria, historical racial prejudice, and weak political leadership. And so they concluded that Congress should apologize on behalf of the United States of America and pay redress payments of $20,000 per person. So Glenn took that commission report and again put all of that language into legislative language, which was the Civil Liberties Act. And then on August 10th of 1988, President Reagan signed that bill, so it became known as the Civil Liberties Act of 1988.
Norm, you're identified in general with a lot of major pieces of legislation, but three in particular. What are your recollections about the Americans for Disabilities Act, and how did that come about?
Well, for me, it goes back to when I was first sworn in as mayor of San Jose. A friend of mine who had been confined to a wheelchair all of his life came to me and asked me if that first week as mayor, if I would stay in a wheelchair as much as possible. And I did that. I had the wheelchair in the back of the car, take it out, get in, go into City Hall. I'd fall on my butt. I couldn't get up over the curb, couldn't go to the bathroom, couldn't get to the water fountain, just things that we take for granted every day. And then when people were talking about putting the Americans with Disabilities Act together, they came to me and asked me if I would put together the transportation portion of that bill. So reflecting back to my mayoral days, I worked on the transportation piece of that with the disability rights organizations here in Washington, D.C. And to me it was a great period because it gave me an opportunity to work with people in the Bush, first Bush 41 administration, President George H.W. Bush, and with Justin Dart, who was the chair of President Bush's Commission for those with disabilities. And to me, that was a a real honor and privilege to have that time to spend working with all these organizations in putting the ADA together.
It's an amazing piece of legislation. One of the other areas of interest on your part was the Intermodal Surface Transportation Efficiency Act of 1991. How did that come about?
Well, I was chairing the Surface Transportation Subcommittee and working with the chairman of the full committee, Chairman Bob Rowe, and the ranking Republican on the full committee, Congressman John Paul Hammerschmidt of Arkansas, and working with Congressman Bud Schuster, the Republican ranking member on my subcommittee. We put together the ICE-T, the Intermodal Surface Transportation Efficiency Act, and that was the first major rewrite of the National Defense Highway Act since when President Eisenhower had signed that legislation in 1956. So I spent a great deal of time putting that together with and what we call the Big Four, and so it was again a monumental piece of legislation because it was part of that era where people were trying to get more power to the states and local governments to be involved in the process on what kind of highway projects or transit projects would be constructed.
When you were in the Congress, you chaired the Public Works and Transportation Committee that dealt with the executive departments. And then you became the Secretary of Commerce, and then you became the Secretary of Transportation, and you had to deal with Congress. What memories stand out in both of those positions, both on both sides of the desk, so to speak, as a member of Congress dealing with the secretaries and as a secretary dealing with the members of Congress? Did serving in Congress prepare you to be a secretary of a major cabinet department?
Well, as chairman of the full committee on public works and transportation, one of the responsibilities you have is always oversight of the department within the jurisdiction of your committee. And of course that was mainly the Department of Transportation. So we would have hearings inquiring about the progress of the legislation that was passed by Congress and how was the executive branch implementing that. So we had a lot of oversight hearings about programmatic issues. So both under President Clinton when I was Secretary of Commerce and under President Bush when I was Secretary of Transportation, I always looked at it in terms of what we had to do in our departments as our doing our own oversight about what we were doing in the department so that we could answer to the Congress as they're exercising their checks and balances over the executive branch of how we were meeting the goals set by Congress. So from a secretarial perspective, I understood what committee chairs were going to be asking about, and I was in a position to reflect how best we could answer those inquiries.
Were the chairman of the committees that you dealt with as secretary as understanding as you were when you were the chairman?
No,
of the
actually, we had a good working relationship between the department and the Senate and the House committees, both authorizing committee as well as the appropriations committees.
Toward the end of your congressional career, you co-founded and chaired the Congressional Asian Pacific American Caucus. Why was the caucus founded, and how did you go about establishing it? What have they accomplished, and has it fulfilled the vision you had when you created it?
Well, as a member of Congress, I would look at the success of the Congressional Black Caucus or the Hispanic Caucus, and think, gee, we don't have one for a caucus that looks out after the interests of Asian Pacific Islanders. And so I started inquiring about how the Congressional Black Caucus and the Hispanic Caucus operated, and then called on not only Asian Pacific American members of Congress, but more importantly, those congressional districts across the country where you would have a relatively large Asian Pacific American population, and enlist those members to join the caucus. And so we had a bipartisan caucus excuse me, that dealt with education, technology, Asian Pacific American issues as they related to, let's say, scholarships or internships, and it got developed that way. And I also set up at the same time an organization outside of Congress, and that's today known as the Asian Pacific American Institute for Congressional Studies. And so that became the outside organization to support the Asian Pacific American Congressional Caucus.
Do you think it's fulfilled the vision you had for it, or still a work in progress?
Well, I think it has done a lot of good in terms of advancing those interests as it relates to specific things relating to the Asian Pacific American community, and especially where it involves education and health issues. I think we've made a great deal of an advance in those areas.
We talked a little bit about your early life and what it was like as a young boy of 10 or 11 years old to be relocated, taken from your community and moved into an internment camp. And that, of course, happened to thousands of Japanese American families. And yet, rather than bitterness that I think you would have been entitled to the United States, you came back and gave back in public service in a variety of ways, and continue to give back. Did that early life or those early experiences, you think, affect your outlook on public service, or why you thought it was very important to be involved in it?
No question it did. We also had an individual who was an immigrant from Japan who said that what happened to the Japanese American community should never ever happen to anyone else again. And in 1946, as people were coming back from the camps to their communities, he said one of the reasons that the Japanese Americans were evacuated and interned, even though the total number was 120,000, was that we really didn't have access to the political leaders of those times. And he said we ought not to let that happen again. So in the San Jose area, this individual, and his name was I.K. Ishimatsu, Mr. Ishimatsu would go around collecting $1, $2 from people. Here they were just returning from camp, had nothing really to speak of. And then he'd buy maybe 2 tickets to the Lincoln Day dinner of the Republicans, 2 tickets for the Jackson Day dinner of the Democrats, and send 2 young Japanese Americans to those functions, because he wanted their visibility to be known, and to then make some connection to the political leaders of those of the 2 parties in our area. Well, by about 60 or so, I became the beneficiary of one of those tickets as well. But again, I think your basic premise, Ron, that you talk about, to me it's always been amazing that something like this happens to 120,000 people, but there isn't any rancor or bitterness that came out of this. But there is a very, very strong conviction in the Japanese American community that something like this should never, ever happen to anyone again. And so I think that's the beauty of it in terms of what Mr. Ishimatsu was trying to do, trying to develop people to be active in the community. I remember when it became possible that I might be appointed to fill a vacancy on the city council in San Jose, and I was talking to my dad about it because I was in business with him. I was a partner of his in the insurance agency and brokerage business. And he said, you know, I always wanted all of you children to be active in the community, but I never expected anyone to be in political office. And he said in Japanese, there's an old adage about if you're in politics, you're going to be like the nail sticking out on a board. And he said, you know what happens to that nail? It always gets hammered. And I always think, Papa, you were so right about being hammered if you are in politics. But by the same token, I think the evacuation and internment was an example of where people should have stood out, be ready to be hammered on a constitutional issue of that nature. And so I think I encourage people to be like that nail sticking out on the board.
If that gentleman had sent you to a Lincoln Day dinner instead of a Jackson Day dinner, would you be a Republican today?
Well, you know, Ron, I was a Republican. No, I was a Republican.
Really?
Until 19, I guess it was in fact it was 1960. Until then, I was Republican until the Kennedy-Nixon election.
I know I've read several times that in several different reports about your relationship with Al Simpson. And Alan Simpson, senator from Wyoming, when you were both young children. How did that come about? And was it really a relationship?
Oh, I love Alan Simpson. What happened was that when we were moved from the Assembly Center, which in our case was a racetrack, Santa Anita racetrack in Southern California, and we were moved then to the more permanent camp in the interior. And those camps were built in Utah, Colorado, Arkansas, Arizona, Idaho, and Wyoming. So the camp we went to from Santa Anita in Southern California was to Heart Mountain, Wyoming, which was about 20 miles east of Cody, Wyoming. Well, we got there in November of '42. Schools weren't ready, and the community elders in that camp wanted to make sure that us young people had something to do. So they had written to the Boy Scouts of America, Girl Scouts of America, to have them come in and organize troops in the camp. So they came in and organized troops at Heart Mountain as they did at other camps. So we'd have a jamboree in the camp, and so our scout leaders then invited Boy Scouts from outside the camp to come in. But here we were, a community of 13,000 people, behind barbed wire, with guard towers every 200-300 feet, with searchlights and machine guns. So when our scout leaders said, come on into the camp for a jamboree, they said, no, we're not going to come in. Those are POWs. We're not going to go in there. So finally, our scout leaders would say, hey, hold it. These are Boy Scouts of America. They're wearing the same uniforms you do. They read the same manual you do. They're going after the same badges, merit badges you do. So finally, the Boy Scouts from Cody came in. And we had our rope tying contests, and we had our, with the knives carving contests. And then we got paired off into tents. And so we got paired off into tents. We built our pup tent. And the first thing you have to have is really a moat around your tent to protect it from the rainwater, and it just could rain in Wyoming at any time. So this kid and I built our moat. Then he said, there's a kid from my troop in that tent below us. I don't really care for him, and I was wondering if we could let the water exit that way. It was no skin off my nose, so I said, sure. So we did. We cut our moat and the water to exit that way. And it rained, and our moat worked perfectly, and the rainwater went to the tent below us, and the tent pegs pulled, and the tent came down, and this kid is sitting there going, hee hee hee, ho ho ho, ha ha ha, about the tent going down next door to us. And I kept saying, Alan, would you please shut up so we can get some sleep? Well, it was Alan Simpson. And we were both 11 years old. The amazing part is that through junior high school, and college, we wrote to each other. Well, in '53, when I graduated from Berkeley, I had my ROTC commission and went straight on active duty, went on overseas, and lost track of him. And then in 1971, when I was elected mayor, Associated Press had a small story about me having won the election for mayor. In the body of that story, it said Mineta was one of 120,000 of those of Japanese ancestry who were interned in camps. He and his family were at Heart Mountain, Wyoming. So the Cody Enterprise then picked up on the story, printed it. Alan was practicing law in Cody, and next thing I get is, Dear Norm, congratulations on being elected mayor of San Jose. I'd been wondering what the heck you'd been up to all these years. And in 1974, I got elected to the House. In 1978, he got elected to the Senate. And our friendship combined again, as if we were still sitting in that pup tent. He and Ann are very, very dear friends to Denny and me. And I just love Alan. He's just a great friend, and so it is a great friendship.
In 1974, you decided to run for Congress. What do you remember about your first campaign and then your subsequent campaigns, your next 10 after that, and how did they change over that time? How about the first one?
Well, the first one was one that I wasn't really contemplating doing. I was mayor of San Jose. I had already indicated I was going to seek re-election as mayor in 1974. And at 5:45 on a Sunday morning, a friend of mine called me up. He says, Norm, have you seen the paper? And I said, are you kidding? It's 5:45 in the morning on a Sunday. I said, of course I haven't seen the paper. Why, what's the matter? He said, Charlie Goopser is not going to seek re-election. I said, well, that's nice. I said, he's served us well. And he says, no, you don't understand. He says, you've got to run for office or run for Congress. And I said, Jim, I've already announced I'm going to seek re-election as mayor. And Mayor Tom Bradley from L.A. came up and we did a fundraiser in November of '73. So I said, thank you for calling, but go back to bed. Well, that night he and some others invited about 25 people over to the house, to my house, invited themselves over to convinced me that I should really take a look at this thing. Well, it had been a Republican seat for close to 50 years, 48 years, as I recall. And so I didn't know whether a Democrat could win this seat or not. But after looking at a number of factors for about 3 weeks, and this is during the whole Watergate time period, I decided to run. So I returned all the money that I raised as mayor and said, here's your money back, but I'm now running for Congress, so feel free to donate to the campaign. Well, interestingly enough, I did get more money back than I had returned, and so that it was a primary in which there were about 6 or 7 running, and the Republican in the November election was a very good friend and a very good candidate, and it was just to me, a good campaign all the way around. The interesting thing is that between my primary and the general, I spent a total of $270,000 in the 1974 race. My last one in 1994, I think I spent something like $1,600,000. The first time was 52%, and in my subsequent elections, I don't think I ever fell below 60%. But that also required me to, over the years, come back 3 weekends out of the month. Come back on Friday, Saturday, Sunday, take the red eye back to D.C., get to D.C. 6 in the morning, and start the week all over again. So those were tough years, I think, in terms of the travel back and forth to the district. But to me, there was nothing more rewarding than to be representing a congressional district and being able to relate to people and their concerns. I've always felt very strongly about accessibility and accountability. And I think that goes back to, again, my own experience in terms of the evacuation and the internment of those of Japanese ancestry. And we didn't have access to our political leaders at the time. And I didn't want to be in that position of having someone say, well, I wanted to talk to him, but didn't have a chance to. And so I always had an accessibility process, but I also felt very strongly about accountability. And so I really enjoyed my 21 years in the House of Representatives. You're much closer to the people there over the years. Over the years, people were saying you ought to consider running for the Senate. But I always felt that when you're in the House, you're representing people, and when you're in the Senate, you're representing issues. And I felt more comfortable representing people and their concerns. I did that kind of constituency service as a member of the City Council, as mayor, and now was doing that in terms of constituency service as a member of Congress.
Constituent service has always been a big role for a member of Congress, and then your ability to get back there, or the fact that you went back all the way to California every weekend, or almost every weekend, is an incredible burden. I don't think part of the I guess the glamour of being in Congress is the responsibility to do that, and I'm not sure most Americans appreciate just how difficult that is, to hop on an airplane Thursday evening or Friday, and then come back again Sunday night, so you're there early Monday morning.
And I'd always fly coach. And I remember one time after I got married in 1991, my wife convinced me that we ought to upgrade to first class. So we got off the plane, and as soon as we walked out of the plane, there was a constituent who happened to be on the plane saying, "Well, I hope you enjoyed your first class seat, Mr. Congressman." And I thought, and then I turned to my new wife and I said, "Now do you understand why I never fly first class?"
That's right. That's always the way. Today is we're speaking today on September 11th, 2006. And 5 years ago, on September 11th, 2001, you were the Secretary of Transportation. And tell me just what happened to you during that day. I know that one of the things you did almost immediately was to ground every airplane in the country, which had never been done before. But go through that day with us as you learned of things that were happening, and what kind of an experience that was for you.
I was having breakfast that morning with the Deputy Prime Minister of Belgium, who also is the Minister of Transport of Belgium, Isabelle Durant. And I had with me at that breakfast meeting Jane Garvey, who was the administrator of the Federal Aviation Administration. And the three of us were having breakfast in my conference room, and John Flaherty, my chief of staff, came in and said, "May I see you, Mr. Secretary?" So I excused myself and went from the conference room into my office. And at the other end of the office is a television set. So as you look at the TV set, obviously it's the World Trade Center, and black smoke was coming out. I said, "What the heck is that?" He said, "Well, we don't know. We've heard general aviation aircraft into the building. We've heard commercial aviation into the building. We've heard maybe possible internal explosion, but we don't know." So I'm sitting there looking at the TV, and I said, "Well, keep me posted. I'm going to go back into the breakfast meeting." So I went back in and explained to them what I had just seen on television. And in about 6 or 7 minutes, John came back in and said, "May I see you, Mr. Secretary?" So I excused myself and went back in. And he said, "It's been confirmed. It was a commercial airplane that went into the building." So I walked up closer to look at the TV set, and I'm trying to assess the size of the hole of in building number 1. And as I'm looking at the TV set, all of a sudden from the right side of the screen comes a gray object and goes across the screen, sort of disappears, and then from the left side of the screen is this yellow, white, orange, billowy cloud all of a sudden. So I go, "Holy cow, what the heck is that?" So then I looked at this scene for a little while, and then I went into the conference room and I said to Mrs. Durant, I said, I don't know what's going on in New York, but I know I've got to attend to it. Jane, you've got to get back to your operations center at FAA. And by the time I came back into the office, we had a call from the White House saying, "Get over here right away." So I grabbed some manuals, excuse me, and some papers, went down to the car, and we sped over to the White House. And we're going in West Executive Drive, people coming out of the White House, coming out of the executive office building. I said to my driver and security guy, I said, "Is there something wrong with this picture? We're driving in, and everybody else is running away." So I went into the Situation Room and got briefed by Dick Clark. Then he said, "You've got to be in the PEOC." I said, "What's the PEOC?" He said, "That's the Presidential Emergency Operations Center." I said, I have no idea where that is. And there was a Secret Service agent standing there. He says, I'll take you over right away. So we went over there. And when I got there, the vice president was there. And this is the bunker that's under the White House, way under the White House. So there's a long conference table, probably 20 feet, 25 feet, and about 8 feet wide. And between each of the seats, there's a phone here. So with this phone, I set up a line to my office, and this one to the operations center at the FAA, and just kept them open all day long. And so trying to assess what was going on. And at that point, the two planes had gone into the World Trade Center in New York. And then there was a young man who came in, told the vice president there was a plane coming down river. So with the phone on the right, I said to Monty Belger, the deputy administrator of FAA, I said, Monty, what do you have on radar? He said, we have a target, but the transponder's been turned off, so we don't know what the plane is, what altitude. We don't know anything about the plane, speed or anything. So I said, well, where is it? He said, well, it's roughly in the Great Falls area. And so then as the plane progressed closer in, then this young man would come in and inform the vice president where the plane was. So I'd say, Monty, where's the plane now? And he said, well, it's somewhere between Roslyn and DCA, National Airport. Then all of a sudden he said, uh-oh, we just lost the target. I said, where'd you lose the target? He said, somewhere between Pentagon City and National Airport. And about that time, someone broke into the conversation and said, Mr. Secretary, we've just gotten word from an Arlington County police officer saying that he saw an American Airlines go into the Pentagon. Well, when you see one of something happen, it's an accident. When you see two of the same thing happen, it's a trend. But when you see three of the same things happen in a very short period of time, then it's a plan. And so I said to Monty Belger, I said, Monty, look, we've got these airplanes that are not unidentified, unaccounted for. And we had maybe 7 or 10 unaccounted for airplanes at that time. And we didn't know what was going on. So I said, Monty, bring them all down. And he said, we'll bring them all down per pilot discretion. And I said, screw pilot discretion, bring them all down. Because I didn't want to pilot over, let's say, Kansas, thinking, I want to sleep in my own bed, I'm heading for LA, I'm going to fly on to LA. I want to get all the planes down so we could start putting all the pieces together. So with the skills of the air traffic controllers and the professionalism of the flight deck crews and the cabin attendants, we had 4,638 airplanes in the air at the time, and in something like 2 hours and 20 minutes they were able to bring them all down safely and without any incident. And I have a computer on my desk that shows all of the airplanes in the air, and my office knew that we had given the order to bring all the airplanes down, and so they'd come in and watch that computer and see these dots disappeared during the course of that 2 hour and 20 minutes. And so by about, I'd say between 12:15, 12:30, there wasn't an airplane in the sky. First time since Orville and Wilbur had been in the air. And then we started letting certain airplanes get into New York because we needed medicine, we needed canine crews and others coming back in to the New York area. So I was there in the bunker until about 4:45 in the morning, in the afternoon. In the meantime, the president was now flying back to Washington, D.C. from Nebraska, and then he was scheduled to give the national address that night originally scheduled for 7:30, but it got slipped back to 8 o'clock. And then after the 8 o'clock national address, which I think lasted about 10 minutes, he then had a National Security Council meeting in the bunker in the PIOC. Now, I'm not a member of the National Security Council, but because of the events of that day, President had me stay for the National Security Council meeting. So I probably finally left the White House closer to 11:15 that night.
What an experience.
It was.
I'm sure one you never want to have to go through again.
Absolutely not.
Was the bringing of the planes down part of a contingency plan that had been in existence, or just something you said that we got to get them down because we got a few of them we don't know
we don't know where we didn't know what was happening. And so I just said to Monty, bring them all down. So because we were trying to, as we were checking with all the airlines, having them inventory their own aircraft as to where they were and everything. And we still had 7 to 10 unaccounted for airplanes. So given the horrific nature of what had already happened, and then we didn't know about the Shanksville airplane at that point, and yet you knew from what Al-Qaeda had always talked about, military icon, government icons, and commercial icon. Well, they struck the commercial icon, the World Trade Center. Now all of a sudden they struck the Pentagon, the military icon. So after we heard about the Shanksville plane going down, people were surmising it was either headed for the White House or the Capitol to get at the government icon.
And most likely the Capitol, I would think. Yeah. You can see the Capitol.
Much more visible.
You don't see the White House very well. And with the kind of damage it did to the World Trade Center, can you imagine the damage that would have occurred if that plane had actually hit the Capitol? Just hard to think about. Those of us who've had the opportunity to serve in there and feel comfortable wandering around the building. Yeah. Let's shift back to some contemporary issues. There's a recent book that's been written by congressional scholars, Tom Mann and Norm Ornstein, arguing that increasing partisanship, in Congress has undermined both public confidence as well as the Congress's own ability to perform its constitutional function. How do you compare your experience in Congress with what you see in Congress today? And do you think there's an increase in partnership, and has it hindered their ability to legislate? And if so, what do you suggest if there's any solution to it?
Well, I think there's no question that the partisanship today is much sharper and much stronger than it was when I left in 1995. And that probably started occurring in the 1992 time period and increased in the 1994 time period. I remember when we could sit down and talk about a lot of things, argue them all out, have fierce battles on the floor, and still be able to go out to dinner or have drinks with friends on the opposite side of the aisle. I remember, and I cherish those moments when I would be invited every so often to those barbecues that Tip O'Neill and Bob Michael had, and with a poker game, and I remember, in the early days when you were there, with John Rhodes as the leader, and the working relationship with Speaker Albert or Speaker O'Neill, and it's just very, very different today. And the kind of conversation doesn't go on. We used to have our first vote on Monday at noon. The last vote was 3 o'clock on Friday. Today the first vote is 6:30 on Tuesday, and the last vote is on Thursday night. And so members rush in Tuesday afternoon, do their vote that Tuesday night, Wednesday do their business, Thursday do their business, and out Thursday night or Friday morning. And they don't get to know each other. And so when you don't know someone very well, it's probably easier to grind at them in a much more personal way. And I think there is that much more divisive partisanship today on both sides of the aisle. And I really think there has to be an interjection of more time being spent, even in terms of the way markups occur. We used to have markups in subcommittee, report the bill out to the full committee, have a markup there, and report out the legislation to the House floor. Now subcommittees are doing hearings, oversight hearings, but most of the legislation is being marked up at the full committee level and not even at the subcommittee. So I don't think there's as much of the deliberative legislative process occurring, and then on top of it, the divisive partisanship that seems to be occurring. As Secretary of Transportation, I spend a lot of time on the Hill talking to members, and I'd say, well, have you talked to Congressman Smith about this? Who's Congressman Smith? Well, he's your colleague on your committee. No, I haven't talked to him. And so the kind of conversations that we used to have are just don't exist. And even I think in the Democratic side and the Republican side, just recently I heard this term rhino, a Republican in name only. Now these are the moderate Republicans who are being isolated by the more conservative members of the Republican Party, and some of that may be occurring with the what do they call it, the yellow dog as compared to the others, the more liberal Democrats. But I think it's not good for the country. I think it does add to the cynicism of people about politics, and I think we really have to return to some semblance of trying to look out for the the needs of the country as a whole, instead of just looking at things from a partisan perspective.
With the schedule they keep today, I'm amazed they can do any oversight at all, which is part of the role of Congress, not just legislating, but seeing if the laws they passed years ago are working and accomplishing what they're supposed to do. But I don't know where they have time.
Well, it's sort of interesting that I believe it was in the 90, let's see, you came in the 93rd Congress.
Yes, 72.
And I think there were something like 400 recorded votes in that session. Today, the number of votes is somewhere in the 1,600 level, but they're on less important issues than the 400 votes you cast in the 93rd, you've got, what was the one they had the other day on slaughtering of horses? Yeah, and I think they spent something like 3 days on that legislation, and it seems to me, I mean, I'm not there right now, but it seems to me there ought to be, there should be more important issues that ought to be occupying their time than 3 days on slaughtering horses and horse meat used for human consumption.
One of the important issues facing the nation today is the balancing of the need for national security while still protecting civil rights and maintaining the freedoms that our nation cherishes. As someone whose civil rights were clearly violated by the internment process of Japanese Americans during World War II, what is your perspective on the current situation?
Well, there's no doubt that national security has to be an important facet of what you do. But there are also ways of dealing with national security in a way that protects the civil rights of individuals. And when the original surveillance bill passed, I was a member of the House Intelligence Committee, and it required the administration to go to court, to the special court under the FISA Act, to have surveillance approved. And that was done purposely in order to protect civil rights, recognizing the need of national security. And that's why this tribunal, special tribunal, was set up for these surveillance cases to go to that three-judge court to have them looked at. So I think there are ways to do that and still at the same time protect the civil liberties of individuals. And so I would hope that in this next Congress that they would deal with that issue. And from what I understand, there seems to be a growing support for doing that again.
You will remember that on the House floor above the Speaker's platform, the words by Daniel Webster, that when I first went there I could read from there. Now I'm asked, what does that say? And I say, I don't know, I can't read it. But what it does say is, let us develop the resources of our land, call forth its powers, build up its institutions, promote all of its great interests, and see whether we also in our day may not perform something worthy to be remembered. In your career, you've accomplished a great many things, certainly an awful lot to be proud of. And over and above the things that you've accomplished, how would you like to be remembered?
Well, again, it's I guess the whole issue of being a good listener, listening to all the kinds of points of view that you have coming at you. But by the same token, none of us can do things to satisfy everybody. So you have to find out what is it that's going to be the best for the greater good. And so over the years, whether it was as a member of the city council, mayor, a member of Congress, or executive branch, always trying to figure out where is that path that gives you the greater good. So I've always hoped that I could end up with people looking at me in terms of what I've done over the years.
Well, you've had an amazing political career, and you certainly have managed to look out for the greater good, I think.